The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda.
Black history is all about representation. It's all about making a point of including the reality that Black people have been a part of this country's history since before it was even this country.
Extreme heat events are becoming more intense and frequent in Canada. The public health risk of heat waves is growing, especially in cities where renters may not have air conditioning. How is this extreme heat affecting our lives, and what can we do to protect ourselves? Let's ask Hao-Sin Chong, climate campaigner for Toronto Environmental Alliance, and Caroline Metz, Managing Director of Climate Resilience and Health for the Intact Centre on Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. Hi to you both.
Hi.
Hi. It's interesting we're having this conversation because if you live in the Toronto area, today's actually like a really nice day. But last week, whoa, you'd leave your home and it feels like you just like walked into like a heat wall. Caroline, I want to start with you. Heat waves seem to be happening more often. What is happening?
So our climate is warming. We've put a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases. They act like a blanket around our planet, trapping heat. So the air is warming, our oceans are warming. And this warming supercharges our weather systems and we get extreme weather. So that's the heavy downpours, the storms, the heat waves, and they're happening in places that never had them before. And they're happening more frequently and more intensely. And when we look at heat, it's really underappreciated, in my opinion. People have a positive association with heat. We go to warm climates on vacation. But heat is actually the leading weather-related killer of all climate hazards. More illnesses and deaths from extreme heat than all other weather hazards combined. And as you mentioned, with heat, recent heat in our area, we have had record heat across many parts of the world and Canada. In 2021, we had the heat dome in British Columbia, and very sadly, 619 people passed away. 2 years ago in Europe, 61,000 deaths from extreme heat. And then just recently, the heat dome across Canada and the US. And this is really dangerous and oppressive heat. And the reality is that the warming that we have is here to stay, and we're going to continue to have these types of extreme heat events going forward, and we need to prepare.
You said something that I think is really interesting. You said that heat is underappreciated. Just this past weekend at Mecca, I think over 1,500 people died because of the heat. But I think for a lot of us, it's like, oh, this is summer. Can you define what's the difference between the hot weather that people might experience in summer as opposed to extreme heat?
So extreme heat is elevated temperatures for a prolonged period of time, and there can be humidity. So when you add humidity to that, it raises the risk. And heat waves and heat domes, those terms can sometimes be used interchangeably. Sometimes we think of heat domes as having a high pressure system that traps air beneath it. That air warms up and it can't escape. But these type of events, regardless of what we call them, they convey a sense of this is a hazard, it's a hazard to our health, and it's a hazard to populations that are more vulnerable or more sensitive to heat, and we need to be taking those populations into account and caring for them.
We're going to talk more about that, but Hao-Sin, is this something that we're going to be seeing for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, the unfortunate reality in a city like Toronto, which is where I do most of my work, is that we're expecting the number of days where the temperature exceeds 30 degrees to more than triple. So right now we see about 20 of them a year. We're expecting by the 2040s anywhere between 60 or 70 of them. So it's a serious, serious issue. And we need to ensure that all Torontonians and tenants in particular, and especially vulnerable populations, are protected from these extreme heats as we continue to do the work of actually cutting our greenhouse gas emissions from things like oil and gas and other fossil fuels.
CBC reported that over 100 heat records were broken in Canada last week on June 19th. Yet there are still people who are still insisting that this is just normal hot weather. How do you convey to people the seriousness of what we're seeing right now, Caroline?
So I think people need to recognize that even though we spend time outdoors and we enjoy being in warm weather, that if we're in a hot environment, and that can be outdoors or indoors for a prolonged period of time, there can be negative health implications. And as Housen mentioned, indoor overheating can be a real problem. We saw in British Columbia during the heat dome in 2021, 98% of the deaths that occurred during that heat dome, very sadly, they were people who were indoors. So it really speaks to this kind of urgency around understanding indoor heat, indoor overheating, and taking measures to protect against that. And just generally, we set our thermostats at about 21 degrees. That's a really comfortable temperature for indoor environments. And anywhere from 21 to 26 degrees C is considered safe. And then from 26 to 31 degrees, there's more risk, and you can have some general negative health consequences from that. And then above 31 degrees Celsius, for an extended period of time, it can be dangerous for almost everyone.
I have two kids in school, elementary school, and my daughter is in a portable, and it's been more than 26 degrees in her portable. Housen, who ends up being impacted the most when extreme heat weather events happen?
It's typically folks like the elderly, people who are have on certain medications, for example, people who don't have very strong social connections are at risk because people aren't necessarily checking in on them. So it's a series of people across the population that are seriously at risk when temperatures go up. And so we saw this again, as you said, in British Columbia, where most of the victims and people who perished were inside their own homes. And so we need to make sure that we have things like mechanical cooling and things like that, because this is not going away, right? Like there was a point in time when air conditioning and mechanical cooling was considered, or indoor cooling in general was considered a luxury, and it's just no longer the case anymore. There used to be considered that indoor heating was a luxury, and then at some point we, as a society, decided we need rules and regulations and things like that to ensure that there is heating indoors during the wintertime. So we need something for the summer as well.
So you're saying air conditioning is not a luxury, it's a necessity?
Yeah, indoor mechanical cooling in general or indoor cooling, cool spaces is not a luxury. It used to be considered that way. It was marketed that way for the longest time. But it's important because as we've seen in British Columbia, when a heat event occurs and extends for a longer period of time, what ends up happening is people end up having serious health issues and sometimes deaths.
It's shocking to me to hear that for a lot of the people who died, they were indoors. We think that if you're indoors, then you're probably a little safer. So when it comes to heat illness, what does that look like, Caroline?
So there's two types of heat illness. The first is heat exhaustion. And generally, symptoms with that are headache, dizziness, fatigue, nausea, red hot skin, excessive sweating. You can have a rapid but weak pulse. And then if that is not treated and it's an extended period of time in a hot environment, that can progress to heat stroke. And that's more serious. And with heat stroke, you have an elevated body temperature a core body temperature above 40 degrees Celsius. And some of the symptoms would be confusion, lack of coordination, again, red hot skin, but now it's dry. So that sweating, the capacity to sweat it's not there. Mm-hmm. And the person can be, they can go into shock, they can have seizures, they can lose consciousness. And then in later stages, body systems can start to fail, and then it can be fatal.
I wanted to read some information from Canadian heat fatality study that shows Statistics Canada released a new study on heat fatalities analyzing 12 cities in Canada from 2000 to 2020. There is an elevated risk of death for Canadians during extreme heat events, a higher risk of death for people over 65, higher risk of death in cities with large numbers of renters. Now, Housen, what are the rules for temperature regulation for people who might be renting in the City of Toronto?
Right now, the rules within the City of Toronto when it comes to cooling is that if your unit has air conditioning or if your building has air conditioning, that the landlord needs to ensure that that's available on hot days, but there's no rule that states that your building needs to have some sort of indoor or mechanical cooling at all. And so the rules currently only apply if there is existing air conditioning in the building or in the unit right now. And so what we've been doing is we've been working with a coalition of tenants and tenant advocacy groups, medical professionals, environmentalists, and lawyers to come and say, hey, we actually need some rules in the city to ensure that indoor temperatures don't go above 26 degrees Celsius. Because if it goes above that, that's when some of these most serious health impacts occur. And we want to make sure that people are safe when we have more of these heat events, which unfortunately we are going to get.
You mentioned that you're working with a coalition, the Toronto Heat Safety Coalition. What are some of the measures that you're trying to put into place?
So we're calling for a series of different measures, both short-term and long-term, to ensure that people are safe indoors. So that includes a maximum heat bylaw. And it also includes things like mechanical cooling, access for people who are renters and Torontonians across the city, access to transit so that you don't have to walk 20 minutes in the blazing sun in order to get to a cooling place, and also things like emergency preparedness for example, something that occurred this past week during the heat event is one of the coalition partners that we work with, they're building their electricity went out. And because their electricity went out, water could not be pumped up past the 7th floor. And there was no air conditioning and no elevator service. And so that was happening in the middle of a heat wave. And so we need to make sure that communities like that are protected as well.
I used to live in a building where you weren't even allowed to put in an AC unit in your building. There's so many rules throughout the City of Toronto that people can just have those stationary fans. Caroline, sometimes it's like that's all you can do is get this fan. What can people do to protect themselves during extreme heat events?
So, as Housen mentioned, mechanical cooling is really important. It can be a matter of life and death to have access to that cooling. But in addition to that, other methods for cooling, there's a really innovative method called passive cooling, and it requires no power. It's quite simple to implement, relatively inexpensive, and it'll get us a few degrees of cooling. And we can think of it as kind of baseline or frontline protection against heat. And what's great is that you can combine it with mechanical cooling, and it reduces the load. So it means that those systems don't have to work as hard. And then you have a buffer in place in the event of a power outage. And what passive cooling is it's simple techniques like learning to use natural ventilation in your space. So opening windows and doors, having ventilation across a room, that helps. Also,
or even on those hot days where it feels like nothing is moving?
Well, you need to have some airflow, and you would do it at night. You would open windows at night, and ideally the temperature at night would drop, so you could move air through a space easily at night and get a little bit of cooling in the evening hours. And then shading on windows. So on the inside of a building or an apartment, having blinds or heat-resistant curtains, and then on the exterior, having shutters or awnings that protect the sun's rays so you don't get the solar radiation coming in through the window. And interestingly, shading on the outside of a building provides 5 times as much solar protection as an interior blind. So any kind of retrofitting on the exterior of the building is really, really helpful. And then also insulation and weather stripping, upgrading that so that the cool air that's in the room stays in the room or the building and doesn't leave.
We only have about 30 seconds. I think we have to continue this discussion at another date. But House in New York State has a program where eligible residents can get up to $1,000 to install an air conditioner. Do you think that's a model that Canadian cities should follow, and why?
Yeah, I think that's something that we need more of in places like Ontario. There are a lot of people who need this, but they're unable to afford either buying an air conditioner or maybe even running an air conditioner. And so having these types of programs to support tenants who are, doing some fantastic things to keep themselves cool and keeping their neighbors safe. And we just need to make sure that these systems are available for them and to listen to what their needs are as well, because it's very, very clear that this is a huge problem. It's only going to get worse, and we need to ensure that people are safe as we continue fighting this challenge of climate change and cutting our emissions.
Thank you so much for being here. I think you've helped us understand why this is something that we need to take more seriously. Really appreciate your time, both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Black Canadians have always been an integral part of shaping this country's history. In a new revision of the Kids' Book of Black History in Canada, author and advocate Rosemary Sadlier provides a look at some of the key periods, events, and people from the last 400 years of Black Canadian history. And it brings Rosemary Sadlier to our studio tonight. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm really great. It's great to have you in studio with me. So this book is an updated version of one published around 20 years ago.
Absolutely.
You have a new artwork and you've added some additional chapters. One is on representation. Why did you feel that this was a missing part of Black history?
Well, I think Black history is all about representation. It's all about making a point of including the reality that Black people have been a part of this country's history since before it was even this country. They've always been here. And so I think that to make a very targeted and intentional mention of representation is a reminder to everyone that we're not doing this just as an additional subject that maybe you'll get to. It's because representation is something that's part of our day-to-day life, and we need to be conscious of all the people that are part of this beautiful country.
And when you talk about representation, it's to say that these people in different genres and different disciplines have been part of Canada's Black history. Or not even just Black history, but Canada's history.
I was going to say that, exactly. They have been part of Canada's history on these lands since before Confederation.
I think there is a perception that people of Black ancestry came to Canada perhaps in the 1950s and the 1960s, but your mother's family in Canada can be traced back to the 1830s, and your father's ancestors arrived in New Brunswick in 1783.
Yes.
How long have people of Black ancestry been a part of this country?
Since before it was founded. There were Black people as part of this country in the 1400s and the 1600s, all the way to the 1600s, but we have a name for one of them, and that person is Matthew da Costa, who by chance did not happen to be enslaved, but was a contract negotiator and worked between and among the First Nations and Europeans on Canada's East Coast. I'm very fortunate that I was able to see to the creation of a Canada Post stamp in his honor. But the great majority of Black people to arrive in this country came in as property of white loyalists, or came in as people seeking their own freedom following the creation or the actualization of that thing we know of as the Underground Railroad.
I think this next question is probably twofold, because I imagine if you are a young Black person hearing that Black people have been in this on this land before it became Canada, you might think, wow, I didn't know that. And then if you are someone who might think that Black people haven't been here for very long, you might think what? Why is it important for us to understand that part of history?
I think it's a counter to the usual narrative that would suggest that we are a land of immigrants. And the way that seems to be understood is that immigrants are recent arrivals. And while that may be true, there are significant numbers of people who have much more recently come to this country, including people like yourself, who have come from the mainland of Africa, have come from places in the Caribbean or South America. But what that does is that they are coming in and adding to and extending a history that had already begun. Again, people of African ancestry have been in North America, but in Canada in particular, since at least the 1400s, helping to found cities like Detroit and Chicago. So I think it should make everybody feel really good to know that they're adding to something wonderful that had already begun.
In this new edition, you have added an African acknowledgement. What is that, and why did you add it?
I was at a conference by 2015, and I had been very much in awe and in appreciation of the land acknowledgements that were being done for First Nations people. But it made me wonder how it was that, as a person who has, like myself, my family has been here since 1783, there needs to be an acknowledgement to help people also appreciate that there is a group, not just my family. There are people who have been helping to contribute to the development of this country since before 1867. So my land acknowledgement is in the book so that people can consider using it when they are doing an event. Consider using it when they're in an event where it's has a focus on Black history.
For more than 2 decades, you led the Ontario Black History Society. I don't believe you were paid for the work that you did.
No, I was not paid.
And at one point, the funding for that organization was cut by 90%. I believe.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But you put your heart and soul to let people know that there is Black history that happened and developed in Canada. Why did you do all that work? Why was it important for you to do it?
Well, John Lewis said that he gets into good trouble. And I think that in my case, I'm just good stubborn. And
that needs to belong on a T-shirt.
Good stubborn, right here.
Yeah.
But the reality is that I know what I had gone through. I know what my parents had gone through. And certainly anti-Black racism in this country takes somewhat of a different form than it might in some other countries, but it is present nevertheless. And when my own children were in school and were coming back, sharing some of the difficulties and the challenges that they were experiencing, the lack of acknowledgement of anything positive having to do with African Canadians, the omission, the negative stereotypes that were readily shared that were coming across in some of the reading materials, and never mind the treatment that they were receiving from certain people, I approached a way of addressing this in what was possible for me at the time. Mm-hmm. And that was in extending and amplifying the work that I was doing as a volunteer with the Ontario Black History Society, and later when I ended up heading it.
I came to this country as a refugee, and I didn't really know the Black Canadian history in this country, but I knew a lot about what happened south of the border in America. Why is it important for there to be a distinction between the difference of the Black Canadian experience as opposed to the Black American experience?
That's a really good question and a really complicated question. I think that people sometimes want to negate that there is a Black experience north of the border, but it's because our experience is different. And it's because Canadians in general are different in how we treat race and in how we handle things like, many aspects of violence and aggression and problems that we might have as a society. In the United States, no one would question where the Black population has come from or that there is one. In Canada, it's a constant question. We are not there by virtue of just not being recognized. So I think that our experience is different because the nature of resistance is different. Sometimes you know, people think there has to be a major riot, and certainly Canada has had that. One of the largest race riots that ever took place in North America, one of the first ones, took place in Birchtown, Nova Scotia. In the 1700s. So, you know, we have had all of those markers of issues and challenges with race relations. We have had segregation. We have had, which is evidenced by the story of Viola Desmond. So I think that it's just to understand the nuances that separate us from the Americans, but at the same time acknowledging the commonality, because it stems from the same phenomenon. And that phenomenon is the transatlantic slave trade, and how that experience marked both of us, both populations, all populations, and helped to create particular stereotypes about Black people that help to keep other systems in place.
When you talk about stereotypes within the book, you have pioneers from the Black community in medicine, in different disciplines, and I think for a young person reading that, it probably instills like a sense of pride. But even when we were talking about the Black experience versus the American experience, living in Toronto, people from the Caribbean and people from Africa are very different. It's not a monolithic experience, right? So when you talked about how when your kids were in school and they weren't learning this, and I know we place so much on teachers, why do you think, I know it's up to the teachers until the new curriculum comes in 2025.
Right.
But why do you think maybe that some teachers may shy away from teaching that history in classrooms?
They shy away from it because they don't know it. They shy away from it because they were not taught it. Unlike the American situation where they do have required Black history, there is no required Black history from kindergarten to grade 12 yet in any place in this country. And when I was able to have February proclaimed as Black History Month following a significant amount of advocacy on my part and building up a community of interest, and when it ultimately did end up being passed with the federal government in December 1995, I had hoped that even though education is not a federal responsibility, that it would add weight to the importance of having a required Black history curricula. It is 2024 right now. This was done in 1995.
30 years.
And it still has not happened. And you're absolutely right. It is very much up to particular teachers to do what they can. And when I myself was in the Faculty of Education, I brought Black history to the graduating class that I was graduating with. And the time that I had became reduced to the last week of school, and I had 10 minutes to do it.
Well, you know, next year, students in grades 7, 8, and 10 will be able to learn about Black history in this province as mandatory. It's a mandatory course. But you've said that this is more of a stepping stone than a milestone. Why do you say that?
I think that it's a late start. I think one of the things that I truly feel is important is to introduce young people, very young people.
What grade would you say?
Kindergarten, even before. Kids see difference. Kids have questions. Kids need to have the right vocabulary to address certain issues that they're facing. And by the time a Black kid is in grade 7, they've already internalized some of the negativity that exists in the grand narrative. And if they have also learned that and internalized it, so have the other students who do not look like them. So it's kind of, in terms of the development, the individual development of that child, Black, white, or purple, it's kind of late in the start. We don't introduce other important ideas that we value, like safety, like sex ed, like religion. In our family situation, we don't wait until somebody is 14 or 12. We do it very early so that we open up the dialogue and have the opportunity to have those challenging discussions in a safe place. And now it also will depend on what the level of awareness is for parents of all backgrounds, and in addition to the level of awareness of those teachers who may also have been deprived that learning opportunity.
Yeah, because I think the first conversation I had with my son was he was 3.5. He was 3.5 years old in junior kindergarten when he first experienced something that was anti-Black, and I had to speak to him at a very young age. But Stephen Lecce, who was the former Minister of Education, when they made this change, he said that Black history is Canadian history. And I just want to read part of the statement from the Ontario Ministry of Education. It said, for the first time starting in September 2025, grade 7, 8, and 10 history classes will include mandatory learning with an emphasis on elevating Black history as Canadian history by highlighting the various Black communities that emerged, developed, and contributed to the development of Canada, including pre- and post-Confederation. Students will now learn about the overwhelming contributions of Black individuals to Canada's foundation as a young nation and the obstacles they faced in the pursuit of building a democratic, inclusive, and prosperous country. You know, education is a provincial responsibility. What do you think other provinces can take from Ontario's lead on this?
I know that other provinces are also working on curricula, but it's kind of spotty across the country. I think that this is going to signal that, you know, it's important to remember that at one point in time, critical mass of Black people in the country resided in the GTA. But that's changing, and we have large numbers of people across the country. So I think that it will signal that this is important and valuable, but I would caution anybody who's considering working on curriculum to start as early as possible.
The Ontario Ministry of Education said that they will consult with educators and the Black community to inform this new learning. If you had the ear of the ministry while they're making this curriculum, what would you say to them?
Well, I kind of already am one of those people that's been approached, but I would definitely indicate that it's important from kindergarten to grade 12. I would definitely also indicate that Black history is, yes, we were talking about historical facts, but we're also talking about Black representation. So there's room and a role for information about African Canadians or the global African community in many other subject areas. I was speaking to a teacher on the weekend who was telling me about a Wolof system of numbering that's very comparable to the way French might number. And I thought, I didn't know about that, but how fascinating. So, you know, there's ways of inserting it in our art courses, in talking about in our English language courses. What are the books that we're giving young people to read? They can all be reflective of, or at points include African Canadian authors and African Canadian experiences.
I think if your book came out in the States right now, in some of the states, this book might actually be banned. We're living at a time where there's a lot of pushback on this conversation around diversity. I prefer inclusivity. And why do you think it's important for all the other students to learn about Black history as well, especially in this climate that we're in right now?
When a Black student learns about Black history, they're being affirmed in their own experience, and it helps them develop a sense of pride. But when non-Black students learn about Black history, what it does is provide a more balanced sense of their own group's historical contribution to this country. And all of the developments, all of the discoveries, all of the positive actions have not been conducted by one gender nor by one race. And when you add Black history to the mix, again, not just facts and figures about you know, the battles, but the lived experience of people over time, it can add to that and extend that.
In our last minute, you included a group of new people in your book, like contemporary Black leaders, artists, innovators. What do they all have in common that you're hoping that kids can learn from?
I think that all of the people in the book are dynamic, are intelligent, are trailblazers, have contributed something, provide a role model for young kids. And Nam, you're in the book.
I know.
And so maybe if I had seen a book like this when I was a kid, I would think, I can be on TV too.
Right. Thank you for including me. It was a thrill to show my kids. It means a lot. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you so much for all the work that you continue to do. It's really appreciated. It's incredible to think that had it not been for all of your work behind the scenes, that we might not even have a Black History Month, let alone the possibility of kids learning about Black history in schools. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you coming into the studio tonight.
There was a time when Richard Peddie couldn't have been more urban. He was the chief executive officer of Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, responsible for bringing the population of a small town into the Scotiabank Arena most nights of the year. So it's somewhat ironic that Peddie's latest book is called Great Small Towns of Ontario, in which he chronicles the qualities that make for this province's 10 best. And Richard Peddie joins us now here in the studio, and it's great to see you again.
Great to see you.
Is book number 4? Something like that?
No, it's number 3, but now I've started publishing books too, so I've got a couple of those.
All right. Okay, when did the man who made his living in the biggest city in the country start to turn his attention to smaller towns?
I think it wasn't small towns originally. It was more, how do you make communities better? And that started when I was in Toronto. I was considering running for mayor, and I started doing a lot of research. I started traveling the Copenhagens and the Amsterdams and the Berlins, and I started reading and started meeting urbanists. Decided wisely not to run for mayor of Toronto. And then I bought I built a house in a little town called Amherstburg. And
Southwestern Ontario, near Windsor?
Just near Windsor. Mm-hmm. And then my wife and I decided there's more we can do in the community, so we opened a bookstore. And then I said, geez, we're doing some good stuff, but what are the other great small towns of Ontario doing? What can I learn from them?
You say, what I like about small towns is that one can get their arms around them. What does that mean?
Well, so I've opened a candy store, a bookstore, a bakery, and a homeware store, about to open a small bar. And if I'd done that in Toronto, it wouldn't have broken through the clutter. It might help a little neighborhood. In a little town like Amherstburg or any of these little towns, you do that, and you can influence the entire psyche of the town.
You say there is a look about small towns, and we're going to, during the course of our conversation, bring up a bunch of pictures from your book. I got to say, it's gorgeous. The book is gorgeous. The pictures are gorgeous. Sheldon, let's do picture number 1 here. This is Almont, Ontario. There's a look. What is that look that you see there in that picture?
Well, I can remember this is Mill Street, and I turned off onto Mill Street, and it's in a bit of a climb, and I just said, wow. This, I think, was the post office. They have 3, they've been really remarkable. So many towns have torn down the great heritage buildings. They've protected 3 of them and repurposed. So it's great. And there's a Naismith trophy statue just at the base of that. And obviously being basketball, that resonated with me. But this, I fell in love with that town the moment I turned into that street.
Just for those who don't know, James Naismith invented basketball.
He did.
Yes, indeed. This is not meant to be a smart aleck question, but you admit in the book you're not a planner, you're not an academic, you're not an elected official. So what exactly qualifications do you have to offer this advice?
Really good question. I did my homework. In my book, I talk about influencers. In fact, Gil Penalosa wrote the foreword. Jennifer Keesmaat quoted. Jason Thorne, who was planner in Hamilton. So I've met all of those, and I've read voraciously. You start with Jane Jacobs, but you go to Jan Geld, and there's so many great books that, I'm self-taught. Oh, Jane Jacobs, when she wrote Life and Death of Great American Cities, was not a trained planner.
Right.
She wrote that just...
Community activist.
Community activist.
Yeah. Your small towns have to have 25,000 population or so to be considered for your book. Why that number?
I say a couple things. Why these towns? Why this number? It's my book. I chose that.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. Let's, Sheldon, picture number 2, if we can here. Big cities need bike lanes. Do small towns need bike lanes?
Well, interesting, all 10 towns don't do anything on cycling.
So what are we looking at there?
That's just that's not a
generic picture.
Towns. That's generic picture.
Okay.
But I do think that they should, all the benefits of biking, the health, getting people out of cars. There's lots of reasons to get into cycling, and I was really pushing it because, one, I'm a cyclist and I believe in this, but I thought it was a way for the towns to differentiate themselves. But none of them it's really resonating. Actually, the one that could be closest to doing a good job on cycling is Amherstburg, and so I make some recommendations on that. Whether the politicians will go along with that, who knows? But I think it'll make a difference in the town.
That was my follow-up question. How interested so far do you see small-town politicians in creating bike lanes?
Pretty much zero.
Pretty much zero.
Yeah.
Okay.
They do some stuff. There's the signs. There's every once in a while a painted. I did not see protected bike lane. I saw little, they'd have a painted route which would end in nowhere. And so then the poor cyclist is, whoa, where am I? So no one's done anything.
Sheldon, picture number 6, please. We talk about hotels. This is one of the hotels that you and I have both stayed at.
Yes.
The Sorbera family, actually. Greg Sorbera, the former finance minister for Ontario, brought this one back to life. This is the Royal Hotel in Picton, Ontario. Now, the conventional wisdom is if you're going to put up a hotel, you got to have a minimum number of parking spots to service the people who
He only has a few behind that.
He's only got a few, and your view is you actually don't need to do that?
Well, no. I think it's where you're at. I mean, that's right downtown. He's lucky enough on his footprint. He has room. I don't think he's got enough parking spots for all his units. I'm not sure about that, but it didn't look like it to me. The hotel that I'm hoping to build in Amherstburg does not have, but we've got parking spots, 350 within a 5-minute walk. So, I talk about parking a lot in this. Parking minimums are a dinosaur. They're a waste of money. They stop so many important things, and that's a big thing with NIMBYs. Like, where are you going to park? No one wants to walk. In Toronto, when I come back to Toronto, I never use my car again. I took the streetcar today, walked to it, but I'll bike, a streetcar, subway. Go walk a little.
So why is it in the heads of so many town councillors that if we're going to put something there, we got to have enough parking?
Well, a lot of them have something called parking minimums, an archaic rule that's now getting wiped out across the United States. In Canada, only a few cities are getting rid of them. They have these arbitrary rules that got kind of created in the early 50s with no science, some ratio. You need 1.5 parking spots for every unit or something like that. There's no science to that. And that's just something. And then with the NIMBYs, they want that, I have to build a park out in front of the bank. So they don't want to go up against that. And the other thing, town councillors are elected on popularity. They really could benefit from this book. There's more learning in this book. Most of them are not traveled to other great towns or cities. They have not read the books that I talk about here. They probably don't know who Jane Jacobs is. There's lots of good stuff out there. But so, you've got a job here, maybe part-time, maybe you're retired. You get elected on popularity. It doesn't say you're prepared to run that town.
So they could stand to read the book.
They could definitely stand to read the book.
Let's do picture 3 here, Sheldon. This is, heritage buildings, we touched on it, but some of them are truly glorious. This is a heritage building in Cobourg, Ontario, about an hour east of Toronto. And then let's flip it over, Sheldon, to number 7. That's gorgeous. That's Port Hope, Ontario. What do you like about these buildings?
Well, it was interesting, and I didn't know it at the start. 9 of the 10 towns were heritage buildings, or heritage towns. I think Cobourg has, I think it's a record with 4 heritage designated areas. Port Hope has 1 or 2, I think 1, but it embraces the whole town is my memory. Heritage, there's all kinds of good reasons for it. It's beautiful. It makes your town attractive to come to. People have pride. My bookstore is a heritage building, and my employees like working in it. People like visiting it. And also, the greenest building is the one that's built right now. Because when you tear down these buildings, you're releasing a lot of carbon emissions, and then how you put the building back together, you use a lot of carbon emissions. So the greenest building is those 2.
Are they not absolute sinkholes for money, though? I mean, they can be money pits.
Yeah, I spent a lot of money on restoring our 1885 building, but you know, it was something that I really had to do. I wanted to make sure, and it's now designated. We asked for it to be designated. I just thought it was really important to protect it. And then there's the benefits of why doing it.
You talk about something in small towns called the third place. What's the third place?
Well, in the 1980s, the sociologists came up with this concept of first place is where you live, second place is where you work, and third place is where you gather. And, you know, it's safe, it's accessible, it's friendly, it's often free, and it's just where a place can come together. And, you know, I read those books, and I thought, opening the bookstore, I said, we want to be a third place. I mean, we entertained about 50 little people yesterday at our bookstore. We've done a couple hundred events where we have all kinds of subjects and we bring people in. It's a gathering place, and I think all towns should have those, and they're coffee shops. They're, you know, some are Tim Hortons, but it's a place people come and gather. That's good.
Why do you think they're critical for communities?
I think it's kind of like a canary in the cave. It's if people aren't intermingling and just staying in their backyard and on Zoom all the time, it can't be healthy. I mean, the loneliness, you know, how many people feel lonely today because they're in front of their phones or their computers? It gets them out. They mingle. You know, it's not always good. There's a book, 13 Ways to Kill Your City, that I read. And one of the things says, you know, I'm a big fan of coffee shops, but it says sometimes those people in coffee shops can just start spinning in it and get angrier and angrier. So it's not always perfect, but any chance you can get people together enjoying stuff, learning stuff, that's a good idea.
One of the things you say is that every great small town in Ontario has an independent bookshop. And we're going to show some pictures here. Sheldon, here's number 4.
This is beautiful.
Furby House. Where's that one?
That's Port Hope.
That's in Port Hope.
That is a beautiful. And along with my bookstore, or our bookstore.
Flip that over.
This is really pretty bookstore.
Next picture, Sheldon. You recognize that place?
That's the River Bookshop.
That is the River Bookshop in
Amherstburg, Ontario.
Who owns that?
Richard Peddie and Colleen. Black Dog Entertainment, actually.
Black Dog Entertainment. And again, the significance of having an independent bookshop in a small town is what?
Well, again, it was my book, right? One of my rules was to qualify for this book, you had to have an independent bookstore. And it's, you know, it's often people that they own that building. In one case, the person was living above it, or no, they usually lease. And it's important. Reading's important. I keep saying we're really pushing at the River Bookshop, or doing a lot of work with kids, because I have this saying that if kids read books, they'll grow up to be better adults. So I just think having an independent bookstore, and none of them have the big bookstores like Indigo or anything like that. So it's a gathering place. It's an education place. It's a fun place. And our values are to educate, engage, inspire, and entertain. That's a bookstore.
My hunch is a lot of people move from big cities to small towns because they want a simpler way of life. They kind of like the nostalgia that comes associated with small towns. And I guess I'm wondering, are you telling the people who run small towns or who live in small towns, you're doing it all wrong, you need to change, and here's how small towns need to change?
There's no doubt that I'm giving them advice, but what am I saying? Protect your heritage buildings, be dedicated to the arts, put in bike lanes, you know, address climate change. The things that I'm doing, I just think make the towns better. It doesn't fundamentally change it. You know, we opened our bookstore 4 years ago, and then all the other stores that we opened, and then others start opening. The town has got more popular, busy. People love coming downtown, and it makes a better small town.
Are the people who live in the small town already, are they suspicious of a guy who comes from Toronto and says,
there's
I'm going
a
to help you?
portion that says, go back to Toronto.
Right, I wonder about that.
They exist, there's no doubt about that, but they're the minority because, you know, I haven't done research on that, but anecdotally, I'm in the store all the time, and I get stopped all the time. And almost the opening, after we chat, and I always ask their name and who they are, and they say, thank you so much for what you're doing for Amherstburg. That is, I wish I'd kept score so I could move it from anecdotal to analytic, that I have a sample size of a couple hundred, because in fact, I've had hundreds of people say that.
How many properties do you think you have affected in Amherstburg? As in purchased, brought back to life, whatever.
There's now a popcorn store, a great little music store that I talk about in the book, where she put in a garage door, and she opens the garage door, and she had a big concert out of this little building on Friday night. There's one of behind us. We don't have a hotel. We're trying to put one in, but we could stand another hotel. There's a new hotel going in. She's restored a building. A woman just did a deal to bring in beaver tails. So there's about 8 or 9 new ones that have come up since we started. Downtown is now walkable because it's pretty and safe, but it has shops, and people are shopping local.
So in a way, it's like a pebble in a lake. You put the pebble in, and the ripples go out.
That's a good example.
People cotton on to this. They do. All right. Let's, Sheldon, 14 here. Tell us what we're looking at here.
This is Allamont with the Mississippi River going through it, not that Mississippi.
Different
And
Mississippi.
there's a water course, and it's just gorgeous. And again, if I'm saying the right things, they have a river walk that is the best of. A lot of them have walks. All of them were pretty much on the water, which was something I found out afterwards. And this has got the most beautiful water walk.
You didn't pick your #1 best small town in Ontario. I think you kind of went out of your way to make sure that you didn't. But, I mean, let's look here. All right. Cobourg, Goderich, Port Hope, Huntsville, Elora, Perth, Almont, Picton, Amherstburg, your place, and Niagara-on-the-Lake. That's your top 10. Do you want to say what #1 is?
No, I've stayed away from that, but there's 3 or 4 that they're all special. Did I like Allamont, which no one has heard of? It's amazing. I ask, have you heard of Allamont? Constantly, no one knows, and but it's gorgeous. But so is Port Hope. Elora is beautiful. It's more than a gorge. Niagara-on-the-Lake, I mean, wins all the prizes. I mean, it's got 3 theaters, and it's got history that goes back hundreds of years, and something like 11 hotels. It's a monster. I almost didn't put it in because it's so clearly special and big, and now they're wrestling with crowds that are huge and parking issues, and but they're all 10 are worth visiting.
Well, let's put these pictures up of Niagara-on-the-Lake, because I know you didn't pick it as #1, but let's face it, most people think, I shouldn't say that.
It won the award, I think, last year for Best in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, why don't you cycle through these, Sheldon? This is,
This
beautiful
is Main
shot.
Street.
Main Street, Niagara-on-the-Lake, for sure, with that beautiful campanile, as they say in Italian, that beautiful clock tower right in the middle of the town. Horse and buggy. I mean, it all looks very special. Wine country.
To get there, there's numerous wineries, and Picton, Amherstburg are all having wineries being developed around them, but they're well ahead of
Beautiful
everyone.
hotel there. That
Prince
hotel
of
is,
Wales, I think.
Yeah, world famous hotel.
Yeah.
And is that it? We got any more pictures? That's the last one. Yeah. So it's I know you don't want to pick one, but it's pretty hard not to say Niagara-on-the-Lake.
I'm not going to say that.
You're not going to say it. You're gonna say it. What needs to happen, do you think, in this province for more of this to take place? More investment in small-town Ontario, more people thinking differently about small-town Ontario, more people considering the possibilities of small-town Ontario?
We got to protect their heritage. Bill 23 that's coming in January really endangers heritage properties. That's not great legislation, but I can tell you the legislation on heritage properties has been around since '77 or something, and so they've all had a lot of time to do it, but they haven't done it, and so now they're vulnerable. So there's that, and it's going to take in Detroit. Dan Gilbert, who owns Cleveland Cavaliers, went in. Detroit, bankrupt, first American city to go bankrupt, major American city to go bankrupt. And he stepped in with a vision, and Detroit's on a roll, but it took someone. So
he's a billionaire, though.
He's a billionaire. So I did well financially. I'm definitely not a billionaire, but Colleen and I decided to step in and invest in this town. So it needs people, it needs leadership. And, I'd like to see that come from council. I think I met some great mayors. I talked to pretty much all of the mayors, some great mayors. They're there. They've got to be championed. They have to be bold. They have to do their homework. They can't just listen to the loud naysayers. And then it helps if there's people like myself and Colleen that come in and say, we're going to get behind this town.
How do you split your time now in terms of Amherstburg versus Toronto?
Pretty much probably 80-20 Amherstburg. But when I come back to Toronto, I eat in a great restaurant every night.
Me too. So you can't, you really can't turn your back on the big city.
No. It's. I love the diversity here.
Mm-hmm.
These towns tend to old, and they're incredibly white, like 93% white. I was on the subway coming out here. It's so diverse, so many different people, and the restaurants reflect that, and the people reflect that, and it's got the arts here. The art gallery. I'm a member of the art gallery. I'm at the ROM. I mean, there's just so much in big cities. So I'm really fortunate that I get to enjoy both.
50 years from now, what do you want Amherstburg, or for that matter, any other small town in Ontario, to look like?
I want it to kind of look like the same as it looks now. Protected. I like to have all these buildings, these heritage buildings protected and there. It was so great that Alamont kept all of theirs. Amherstburg, though, had a town hall and a big hotel, and they were all torn down. They've lost so much. So I'd like to see them protected. I'd like to see them have bike lanes. I hope that they and the whole world has addressed climate change so that we exist. I think they can still be pretty special 50 years from now.
Because I suspect a lot of people think it's too big for one person to do. But I guess your example is one person can get in there and make a difference.
Yeah, and now I'm getting all kinds of help. My next door neighbor, Dan Jimis, is doing a big rib fest this week, and Lori Barrett behind me wants the concept of retiring a street. She's championing closing a block of a street, which you see closed streets all through Europe. Montreal, the mayor of Montreal's done that. So there's people stepping up, and it gives me comfort that we're not alone.
Good stuff. It's a beautiful book, and people should take the summer, if they can. Take the summer, go around, visit lots of small towns.
It's a travel log, a big part of it, 90 photographs, and it is travel log, and it's kind of timeless, but I think it'll be pretty relevant for a long time.
Excellent. Great small towns of Ontario. And it's brought Richard Peddie to the big city, right in the middle of the big city, to talk about it. Richard, good to see you again.
Always nice to be on this show. Thanks.
Tomorrow on the agenda.
The Toronto Star Building is no longer the Toronto Star Building. There was Captain John's seafood ship, which was a landmark floating on the lake. That's gone. And I was like, uh-oh, this is like, the change in the city is way more dramatic than I thought.
That's tomorrow on the agenda.